Picture this. A village in Eastern Europe, 1725, deep winter. The snow is stained red. 9 bodies in 8 days, all bearing the same marks. Pale skin, sunken eyes, and 2 wounds at the throat. The living are terrified. The dead, they whisper, are not staying dead. In 3 days, the entire village will gather at the cemetery with shovels, stakes, and the local priest. They will open a grave that has been sealed for 3 months. What they find inside will be documented by an Austrian military officer and filed away in the Imperial archives. This is not folklore. This is a government report. You know the vampire, the elegant count in the black cape, the seductive immortal, the tragic anti-hero of modern cinema. That vampire was invented in 1897 by an Irish theater manager who had never seen the terror that birthed the legend. The real vampire was not seductive. It was not elegant. It was a corpse, bloated and wet with blood, that the living believed was crawling from its grave at night to drain the life from their families. It was a plague that could not be explained, a horror that could not be stopped, and a solution so desperate that entire communities became executioners of the dead. Before Stoker, before Byron, before the vampire became a symbol of forbidden desire, it was something else entirely. It was a father who died of tuberculosis, then his daughter, then his son. It was a soldier who warned his friends that something had attacked him in Kosovo, and when he died, 17 others followed. It was a young woman in Rhode Island whose heart was cut from her chest and burned to ash by her own neighbors. These were not stories. These were autopsies, testimonies, and mass graves. Tonight, we descend into those graves. Tonight, we meet the vampire before Dracula, the one history tried to bury, but could never quite kill. Picture this: Eastern Europe, 1692. A farming village at the edge of the Ottoman frontier, where the forests are thick and the winters are long. You are lying in bed, listening to your daughter cough in the next room. She has been sick for weeks now, pale, feverish, complaining of nightmares. 3 nights ago, your neighbor died of the same illness. Last week, it was the blacksmith's son. You know what is happening. Everyone knows. This is not a disease. This is something else. Something that comes in the night, that slips through locked doors, that drinks the life from the living while they sleep. The priest says it is God's punishment. The old women say it is the dead returning. You do not care what it is called. You only know that if something is not done soon, your daughter will be next. This is not the vampire you know. This is not the elegant count in evening dress, the seductive immortal who asks permission before he enters. This is the vampire before Bram Stoker sanitized it for Victorian England, before Hollywood turned it into a tragic anti-hero. This is the original vampire, the plague that walked, the corpse that would not stay buried, the horror that could only be stopped with a stake and fire. Before we descend into the graves of Eastern Europe, I want to ask something of you. If you believe these dark chapters of history, these forgotten panics and desperate acts, deserve to be remembered, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps the candle burning in the darkness, allows us to keep opening the archives that most would prefer stayed closed. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Because what we are about to discuss happened at night. Always at night. Tonight, we will trace the birth of the vampire legend through the villages of Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. We will examine the medical reality that created the supernatural belief, tuberculosis, premature burial, and the stages of decomposition that look like signs of undead life. We will meet the real vampires, the ones documented in church records and government reports. And we will ask the question that haunted those villages. What do you do when the dead will not stay dead? To understand the vampire, you must first understand the world that created it. 17th century Eastern Europe was a place of plague, war, and starvation. The Ottoman Empire pressed from the south, the Habsburgs from the west, and caught between them were villages that had known nothing but suffering for generations. Life expectancy was 30 years. Half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Winter meant hunger. Spring meant soldiers. Summer meant disease. And then there was tuberculosis. They called it consumption, and the name was precise. It consumed you slowly, over months or years. First came the cough, then the fever, then the wasting away. Your skin grew pale, almost translucent. Your eyes sank into your skull. You coughed blood. You could not eat. You could not sleep. And slowly, inexorably, you faded. You became a ghost before you died. But here is what terrified the villages. Tuberculosis did not kill alone. It moved through families like a curse. A father would die, and within months, his wife would show the same symptoms. Then the eldest son, then the daughter. One by one, the disease would take them all. To the people of the 17th century, who knew nothing of bacteria or contagion, this pattern looked like something else. It looked like the dead were feeding on the living. The logic was brutal, but consistent. The father dies. He is buried. But something of him remains. Something hungry. At night he rises from his grave and returns to the house where he lived. He cannot eat food. He is dead, but he can drink life. He drains it from his wife while she sleeps, from his children, from anyone he loved in life. They sicken. They die. They join him in the earth. And the cycle continues. This was not folklore. This was medical diagnosis. When a village was struck by consumption, the elders would gather. They would ask, "Who died first? Who is killing the others?" And when they had their answer, they would go to the cemetery. They would open the grave, and they would look for the signs. The signs were specific. A vampire, they believed, did not decay like normal corpses. Its skin remained ruddy, almost lifelike. Its hair and nails appeared to have grown. If you pressed on its chest, blood would seep from its mouth. Its body would be bloated, swollen with the blood it had drunk from the living. These were the markers. These were what they looked for when they broke open the coffin and peered inside. We know now what they were seeing. We understand the stages of decomposition, how gases build up in the body and create the illusion of swelling. We know that skin contracts after death, making hair and nails appear longer. We know that pressure on a decomposing body will force fluids from the mouth. We know that in the right conditions, cold, damp earth, a body can remain relatively preserved for weeks or months. But they did not know this. All they knew was that the dead man in the grave looked alive, and that meant he was still feeding. The solution was as brutal as the diagnosis. Once a vampire was identified, it had to be destroyed. The methods varied by region, but the goal was always the same: to pin the corpse to the earth so it could not rise. In Serbia, they drove a wooden stake through the heart. In Poland, they placed a sickle across the throat so that if the corpse tried to sit up, it would decapitate itself. In Silesia, they placed stones and coins in the mouth to prevent it from biting. And if the vampire was particularly virulent, if it had already killed many, they would burn the body entirely and scatter the ashes in running water. These were not secret rituals performed by superstitious peasants in the dead of night. These were public acts, witnessed by entire communities and documented by local officials. When a vampire was exhumed and destroyed, a report was filed. The priest recorded it in the parish register. If the village was under Habsburg or Russian control, a government official might be called to observe. What survives in the archives is not folklore, it is bureaucracy. Forms filled out in triplicate, describing how a corpse was staked and burned, and why. The vampire panic peaked in the early 18th century, particularly in the 1720s and 30s. This was when the Habsburg Empire was expanding into the Balkans. Absorbing regions that had been under Ottoman control for centuries, Habsburg officials, educated men of the Enlightenment, found themselves confronted with something they could not explain. Entire villages gripped by terror, demanding permission to exhume and mutilate the dead. And so, they documented it. They wrote reports. They sent them to Vienna. They asked for guidance. What they created, inadvertently, was the first written record of the vampire as Europeans understood it. But the vampire did not begin in the 18th century. It was not born from Enlightenment rationality trying to explain peasant superstition. The vampire is older than that. It is as old as the fear of death itself, as old as the first human being who looked at a corpse and wondered if something of the person remained. What changed in the 18th century was not the belief, but the documentation. For the first time, the vampire was written down, catalogued, analyzed. It moved from oral tradition into official record. It became, in a sense, real. This is where our story truly begins. In the villages of Serbia and Wallachia and Silesia, where the dead were rising and the living were dying, and where desperate communities did what they believed they had to do to survive. In the next chapter, we will meet the first vampire to be documented by name, by date, by witness testimony. We will descend into his grave. We will see what they saw, and we will understand why, for the people who lived through it, the vampire was not a myth. It was a plague that had to be stopped, no matter the cost. Kisilova, Serbia, January 1725. A village of perhaps 200 souls nestled in a valley where the Morava River bends. The winter is particularly brutal this year, the kind of cold that burns your lungs, that makes the ground as hard as iron. In the past 8 days, 9 people have died, all of them complaining of the same thing before they succumbed. A weight on their chest at night, a shadow in the corner of the room, the feeling of being slowly drained. The village elders know who is responsible. His name is Peter Plogojowitz. He died 3 months ago, in late October, of natural causes. He was 60 years old, a farmer, unremarkable in life. But in death, he has become something else. Every person who has died in the past week reported the same vision in their final days. Peter Plogojowitz came to them in the night. He sat on their chest. He strangled them. He drank. The villagers have made their decision. They will open Peter's grave. They will see if he is truly dead, and if he is not, if he shows the signs. They will do what must be done. But this is Habsburg territory now, claimed from the Ottomans just 15 years prior. They cannot simply dig up a corpse and destroy it. They need permission. They need a witness. They need it documented. This is where our story becomes history instead of folklore. Because on January 7th, 1725, an Austrian Imperial provisor, a government official named Frombald, arrived in Kisilova to investigate. He was not there to participate in superstition. He was there to observe, to report, to document for the imperial authorities in Vienna what these people believed and what they intended to do about it. What he witnessed, he wrote down. And what he wrote survived. Frumbald's report is cold, bureaucratic, the language of a man who does not believe what he is seeing, but cannot deny that he is seeing it. The document is titled Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered. It begins with a complaint. 9 people have died in 8 days, all claiming to have been throttled in the night by Peter Plogojowitz, deceased. The villagers are threatening to abandon Kisilova entirely unless the body is exhumed and measures are taken. Frumbald, as the ranking imperial official, has been sent to oversee the procedure. Picture the scene. January 8th, 1725, just after dawn. The entire village has gathered at the cemetery. They carry shovels, stakes of hawthorn wood, and torches. The local priest is there, though he is not leading the ceremony. This is not a Christian ritual. Frumbald stands apart, observing, his ledger open. The ground is frozen. It takes 2 hours to break through the earth above Peter Plogojowitz's grave. When they finally pry open the coffin, everyone steps back. Because Peter Plogojowitz does not look 3 months dead. His skin is ruddy, almost pink. His hair and beard have grown. His nails are long and curved. When they press on his chest, fresh blood seeps from his mouth and nose. His body is swollen, bloated. He looks, Frumbald writes, more alive than the corpses of those who died yesterday. The villagers know what this means. Peter Plogojowitz is a vampire. He has been rising from his grave at night, traveling to the homes of his former neighbors and drinking their life force. The proof is in front of them. The old skin has fallen away, Frumbald notes, and a new skin has grown beneath. This is not decay. This is renewal. This is a corpse that is feeding. We know now what they were seeing. Peter Plogojowitz likely died of a sudden hemorrhage or stroke, something that left blood in his tissues and organs. The winter cold preserved his body, slowing decomposition. As gases built up inside the corpse, they pushed blood and fluids to the surface. The skin darkened and sloughed off in places, making the paler tissue beneath look fresh. The nails appeared longer because the skin around them had contracted. Every sign they interpreted as evidence of undeath was actually evidence of normal post-mortem changes. But Frumbald does not offer this explanation. He is a bureaucrat, not a physician. He records what he sees, a corpse that appears to have fed recently, surrounded by villagers who are absolutely certain of what must be done. And Frumbald, despite his Enlightenment education, despite his rational Austrian mind, does not stop them, because 9 people are dead, and the village is on the edge of panic. And sometimes keeping order means allowing the irrational. They drive a stake through Peter Plogojowitz's heart. Frumbald describes this in his report with clinical precision. The stake is hawthorn wood, approximately 3 feet long, sharpened to a point. It is driven through the sternum and into the earth beneath, pinning the corpse to the bottom of the grave. When the stake pierces the body, blood erupts from the mouth and ears, fresh blood, red blood. The villagers cry out. This is proof. This is the vampire being destroyed. But they are not finished. The body is lifted from the coffin and carried to a clearing outside the cemetery. Wood is stacked around it. Oil is poured over the corpse. And then they set it on fire. Peter Plogojowitz burns for 4 hours. The villagers watch until there is nothing left but ash and bone fragments. Then they gather the remains and scatter them in the Morava River. Let the water carry him away. Let him never return. Frambald writes all of this down. He notes the date, the names of witnesses, the exact procedures followed. He sends his report to the Imperial Sanitary Commission in Vienna, and the commission, to their credit, does not dismiss it. They do not call the villagers ignorant or superstitious. They simply file the report away, along with dozens of others arriving from the newly acquired Balkan territories, all describing the same phenomenon. Corpses that will not decay, deaths that cluster in families, communities that believe the dead are rising. The Plogojowitz case is significant because it is documented. It moves the vampire from folklore into official record. This is not a story told around a fire. This is a government form, signed and dated, describing an act of corpse mutilation performed with state observation. And it is not unique. In the same year, 1725, similar cases were reported from across Serbia, Wallachia, and Silesia. The vampire was not a Serbian phenomenon. It was a plague. After Peter Plogojowitz was destroyed, the deaths in Kisilova stopped. 9 people had died in 8 days. After the exhumation, no one else fell ill. The villagers took this as confirmation. The vampire had been eliminated. The threat was over. From a modern perspective, we might explain this differently. Tuberculosis often burns through a family or household and then stops when there are no more vulnerable hosts. The clustering of deaths was coincidence, not causation. But try telling that to people who have just watched their neighbors die one after another, all reporting the same nightmare. Frambald's report ends with a bureaucratic note. The matter has been resolved. The village is calm. No further intervention is required. He does not editorialize. He does not speculate. He simply records that the people of Kisilova believed they were being attacked by a vampire, that they exhumed and destroyed the suspected corpse, and that the deaths ceased afterward. The Empire asked for documentation. He provided it. His job was done. But the story of Peter Plogojowitz did not end in Kisilova. Frambald's report was copied and circulated among imperial officials, physicians, and clergymen throughout the Habsburg lands. It was read in Vienna, in Prague, in Budapest. And it was read with fascination and horror, because it confirmed what other reports were saying. Something was happening in the Balkans, something the authorities did not understand. The dead were not staying dead, and the living were taking matters into their own hands. In the next chapter, we will meet another vampire, another exhumation, another report. But this time, the investigation will be more thorough. The documentation will be more detailed, and the case will become the template for every vampire story that follows. Because 5 years before Peter Plogojowitz, there was Arnold Paole. And what happened in the village of Medvedja makes Kisilova look merciful. Medvedja, Serbia, December 1731. A military surgeon named Johann Fluckinger arrives from Belgrade with orders to investigate. Over the past 3 months, 17 people have died in this village of approximately 400 souls. All showed the same symptoms: fever, weakness, the wasting away of consumption. But there is something else, something that has the entire region terrified. The villagers say, this is not disease. They say this is Arnold Paole, dead for 5 years, still feeding. Arnold Paole was a soldier, a Hajduk, one of the irregular fighters who battled the Ottomans along the frontier. He returned to Medvedja in 1727 after years of service in Kosovo and Wallachia. He was 25 years old. He wanted to marry a local girl named Nina. He wanted to farm. He wanted peace after years of war. but he brought something back with him, something dark. Paole told his fiancée that he had been attacked. During his service near Gosowa in Kosovo, he had been stalked by a vampire. He described waking in the night to find a weight on his chest, a presence feeding on him. The attacks continued for weeks. He grew weak, feverish. His comrades noticed. They told him what he had to do: find the vampire's grave, eat earth from it, and smear himself with the vampire's blood. Only then would the curse be broken. Paole claimed he had done this. He found the grave, he never said whose, and performed the ritual. The attack stopped. He returned to health. But he told Nina that he was marked now, that if he died before his natural time, he would become what had attacked him. Nina did not believe in such things. She was educated, the daughter of a merchant. She thought war had damaged Arnold's mind, that he had seen too much death. She agreed to marry him anyway. In the summer of 1727, 3 months after returning to Medvedja, Arnold Paole fell from a hay wagon and broke his neck. He was dead within hours. The village buried him in the cemetery, and for 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then the deaths began. 4 people died in rapid succession, all complaining that Arnold Paole had visited them at night, that he sat on their chests, that he drank. The village elders made their decision. They exhumed Arnold's body. What they found was recorded in testimony given 4 years later to Johann Flückiger. The witnesses described Arnold Paole's corpse as completely intact after 3 weeks in the ground. His eyes were open. His mouth was stained with fresh blood. His fingernails and toenails had fallen off, and new ones had grown beneath. When they drove a stake through his heart, the corpse let out a terrible groan and bled profusely. They burned the body and scattered the ashes. The deaths stopped. For 4 years, Medvedja was quiet. The vampire had been destroyed. The village returned to normal. But in 1731, the deaths began again. This time, it was worse. 17 people died in 3 months. And this time, the Habsburg authorities took notice. Because Medvedja was on a major military route between Belgrade and the frontier, the army needed to know if there was plague, if the route was compromised. They sent Flückiger to investigate. Flückiger was not a superstitious man. He was a trained surgeon, educated in Vienna, a man of and reason. He arrived in Medvedja with instructions to determine the cause of death for the recent victims and to submit a detailed medical report. What he documented over the next 2 weeks would become the most detailed account of vampire exhumation ever recorded. His report, Visum et Repertum, runs to multiple pages. It includes names, dates, physical descriptions, and autopsy findings for 13 exhumed corpses. Flückiger began by interviewing the survivors. They told him that the recent deaths began with a woman named Stana, 40 years old. Before she died, Stana confessed that she had eaten the flesh of a sheep killed by a vampire. This was significant. The villagers believed that vampires did not only attack humans. They also killed livestock, draining the blood from cattle and sheep. Anyone who ate the flesh of such an animal would themselves become infected. Stana died screaming that something was sitting on her chest. 3 months later, her body was exhumed. Flückiger described Stana's corpse with clinical precision. The body was completely fresh, he writes, showing no signs of decomposition. The skin was clear and healthy. When they opened the thoracic cavity, the heart and lungs were filled with fresh, liquid blood. The stomach contained partially digested food. Flückiger notes that this is impossible. A body dead for 3 months should be skeletal. This corpse looked 3 days dead at most. But Stana was not alone. Flückiger exhumed 12 more bodies, including a 16-year-old girl named Melissa, who had died after only 3 months of illness, and a woman named Rusha, who was 60 years old. In every case, the findings were similar. Bodies that had not decayed, organs filled with liquid blood, skin that appeared healthy and flush. Flückiger measured, documented, took samples. He was trying to find a medical explanation for what he was seeing, because he could not deny that he was seeing it. The report includes testimony from multiple witnesses about Arnold Paole's original exhumation 4 years earlier. They all agreed. When the stake pierced his heart, the corpse groaned and bled as if alive. This detail appears in multiple accounts. It is not folklore embellishment. It is sworn testimony given to an imperial official. And Flückiger includes it in his report because, despite his medical training, he has no explanation for it. The solution in 1731 was the same as in 1727. The 13 corpses were removed from their graves, decapitated, and burned. The ashes were scattered in the Danube River. Garlic was placed in the mouths of recently deceased villagers before burial to prevent them from becoming vampires. And the deaths stopped. 17 people had died in 3 months. After the mass exhumation, no one else fell ill. The village recorded no further vampire attacks. Flückiger's report was submitted to the Imperial War Council in Vienna in January 1732. It was copied and distributed to physicians, clergymen, and natural philosophers throughout Europe. It was translated into French, German, and Latin. It became, in effect, the definitive medical document on the vampire phenomenon. And it sparked a debate that would rage for decades. Were vampires real? Or were the witnesses simply misinterpreting natural processes they did not understand? The Enlightenment mind struggled with the Medvedja case. On one hand, Flückiger was a trained surgeon, a rational man, and his observations were precise. On the other hand, corpses do not groan when staked. Blood does not remain liquid for months after death. The findings contradicted everything medical understood about decomposition. Some physicians argued that unusual soil conditions or extreme cold could preserve bodies. Others suggested mass delusion, that the witnesses saw what they expected to see. But no one could fully explain the evidence. What we know now is that Flückiger was observing multiple bodies in different states of decomposition, all influenced by the cold Serbian winter. Some corpses, buried in frozen ground, remained preserved for months. Others, buried in warmer conditions, decomposed rapidly, but accumulated gases that made them appear swollen and alive. The liquid blood he observed was likely decomposition fluid, dark and viscous, which in poor light could resemble fresh blood. The groaning sound when the stake was driven through Arnold Paole's chest was gas escaping from the lungs, forced out by the compression of the rib cage. But here is what matters. Johann Flückiger was not lying. He was not fabricating evidence. He documented what he saw with the tools and knowledge available to him. And what he saw, combined with the testimony of dozens of witnesses, created the template for the modern vampire. The creature that rises from the grave. The corpse that bleeds when pierced. The plague that moves through families. The horror that can only be stopped with stake and fire. All of this comes from Medvedja. All of this comes from Arnold Paole. The Arnold Paole case was not the first vampire exhumation, but it was the first to be documented with this level of medical detail and imperial authority. It moved the vampire from folklore into medical literature, from oral tradition into printed text. When the report was published and circulated, it created a sensation. People across Europe read about the vampire and recognized something they already knew, something their grandparents had whispered about. The vampire, they realized, was not a Serbian superstition. It was universal. In the next chapter, we cross the Atlantic. Because the vampire did not stay in Europe. It traveled with immigrants to the New World, where it found fertile ground in the isolated villages of New England. And in 1892, in a small town in Rhode Island, the last documented vampire exhumation in American history would take place. Her name was Mercy Lena Brown, and what her family did to her corpse was worse than anything that happened in Medvedja. Exeter, Rhode Island. March 17th, 1892. A cold morning, the ground still frozen from a brutal New England winter. In the cemetery behind the Baptist church, a small group of men gather with shovels and lanterns. They are here to dig up 3 graves. Mary Eliza Brown, dead 7 years. Mary Olive Brown, dead 6 months. And Mercy Lena Brown, dead just 2 months ago, in January. The men are the Brown family and their neighbors. They are educated men, farmers and tradesmen, some of them Baptists, some Congregationalists. They read newspapers, they vote. And this morning, they are going to cut the heart from a dead girl and burn it to ash. This is not Serbia in 1725. This is America at the end of the 19th century. The electric light has been invented. The telephone connects cities across the continent. Railroads span from coast to coast. In 8 years, the Wright brothers will achieve powered flight. And in a small farming town in Rhode Island, people still believe that the dead are rising from their graves to feed on the living. The vampire did not die in the old world. It crossed the ocean. And it found its final, most documented victim in a 19-year-old girl named Mercy Lena Brown. To understand what happened in Exeter, you must understand the pattern. The Brown family had been dying for 7 years. It began in December 1883 when Mary Eliza Brown, the mother, began coughing. She was 45 years old, strong, the backbone of the family. Within 6 months, she was dead. Her daughter, Mary Olive, fell ill almost immediately after the funeral. She lasted 13 months. Then the eldest son, Edwin, began showing symptoms. He coughed blood. He lost weight. He sweated through the night. George Brown, the father, watched his family disappear one by one. He was a farmer, a practical man, not given to superstition. He believed in medicine. He sent Edwin to Colorado Springs, to the dry climate that doctors said could cure consumption. Edwin improved. He stayed west for 2 years. And then in 1890, he returned home for Christmas. His youngest sister, Mercy, wanted to see him. She was 17, healthy, full of life. Within 3 months of Edwin's return, Mercy was sick. Mercy Lena Brown died on January 17, 1892. She was 19 years old. The local newspaper, the Narragansett Weekly, published her obituary. It described her as patient in her suffering, cheerful and hopeful to the end. She was buried in the cemetery behind the church in the frozen ground of a Rhode Island winter. Edwin, who had returned from Colorado, was now dying faster than before. The disease had come back with a vengeance. He was wasting away. And he told his father that Mercy was visiting him at night. The neighbors began to talk. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Mary Eliza had died first. Then Mary Olive. Now Mercy. And Edwin was dying. Something was moving through the Brown family, taking them one by one. The old people in Exeter remembered stories their grandparents had told, Stories brought from the old country, from Scotland and Ireland and Germany. Stories about the dead who would not stay buried. About consumption that passed like a curse. About the remedy. George Brown did not believe in vampires. He was a modern man, a 19th century American farmer. But he believed in his son, and his son was dying. The doctors had no cure. The sanitariums had failed. And the neighbors were saying that if something was not done, Edwin would follow his mother and sisters to the grave. So George Brown, against everything he thought he believed, gave his permission. They would exhume the bodies. They would check for the signs. And if they found what the old people said they would find, they would do what had to be done. On March 17th, 1892, they opened the graves. Mary Eliza, dead 7 years, was skeletal, exactly as expected. Mary Olive, dead 6 months, had also decomposed normally. But Mercy, dead only 2 months, was different. Her body was preserved, still intact, her skin showing no signs of decay. When they turned her over, liquid blood pooled in her chest cavity. Her heart and liver, when examined, were engorged with blood. The men looked at each other. They knew what this meant. A doctor was present. His name was Harold Metcalf. He had come from the town of Wickford, not to participate but to observe. Metcalf was a medical professional, educated, rational. He examined Mercy's body and confirmed what the others saw. Minimal decomposition, liquid blood in the organs. He did not call it vampirism. He had no explanation for it. He simply documented that the body was remarkably well preserved for having been buried in winter for 2 months. But he did not stop what happened next. They removed Mercy's heart and liver. They built a fire on a flat rock near the cemetery, and they burned her organs to ash while the family and neighbors watched. The Narragansett Weekly reported this event. So did the Providence Journal. The story spread across Rhode Island, then across New England, and eventually across the country. Newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago printed accounts of the exhumation. Some reports were sympathetic. Others mocked the Browns as ignorant peasants. But all agreed on the facts. In 1892, in the United States of America, a family had dug up their daughter and burned her heart because they believed she was a vampire. The ashes of Mercy's heart were mixed with water and given to Edwin to drink. This was the cure. This was how you broke the vampire's hold. You consumed the ashes of the vampire's heart, and the connection would be severed. Edwin drank, and for a few weeks, he seemed to improve. His fever broke. He could eat again. The family allowed themselves to hope. But consumption does not work that way. By May, Edwin was worse than before. On May 2nd, 1892, less than 2 months after his sister's exhumation, Edwin Brown died. He was 24 years old. The Mercy Brown case became infamous. Newspapers called it barbarism, superstition, a shameful reversion to medieval ignorance. The Providence Journal ran editorials condemning the practice, arguing that this was proof that rural Rhode Island needed better education and medical access. Anthropologists and folklorists descended on Exeter to document the beliefs that had led to the exhumation. The case was studied, analyzed, and held up as an example of how ignorance persisted even in the modern age. But here is what the newspapers did not say. The Mercy Brown exhumation was not an isolated incident. It was the last in a series of similar cases that had been occurring throughout New England for decades. In 1854, in Griswold, Connecticut, the Ray family had exhumed 2 sons and burned their organs. In 1874, in Peacedale, Rhode Island, William Rose's family had dug up his daughter. In 1889, in Cumberland, Rhode Island, Nellie Vaughn's grave was disturbed under mysterious circumstances. The vampire panic was not a Serbian import. It was an American phenomenon. These cases followed the same pattern. A family struck by consumption, deaths clustering in a specific sequence, survivors reporting dreams or visions of the dead, and finally, exhumation and destruction of the suspected vampire's remains. The practice was known. It was whispered about. It was done quietly, usually without official sanction. The Mercy Brown case was unusual only because a doctor was present and newspapers reported it. Most vampire exhumations in New England went undocumented, performed in the night by desperate families who told no one. We understand now what killed the Brown family. Tuberculosis is contagious. It spreads through close contact, through the air, through shared living spaces. In a farmhouse in rural Rhode Island, where the family ate together, slept in close quarters, and spent long winters indoors, the disease would have passed from person to person inevitably. Mary Eliza infected Mary Olive. Mary Olive infected Edwin. Edwin, when he returned from Colorado carrying the dormant bacteria, infected Mercy. The pattern that looked like supernatural predation was simply the progression of an infectious disease. But the Browns did not know this. Germ theory was still new, still not fully accepted even in medical circles. The mechanism of tuberculosis transmission would not be fully understood for another decade. All the Browns knew was that their family was being destroyed, that the pattern was consistent, and that the old remedy, the one their ancestors had brought from Europe, was their last hope. They did what they believed they had to do. And when it failed, when Edwin died anyway, they had to live with what they had done to Mercy's body. Mercy Lena Brown's grave still exists. It is in the cemetery behind the Baptist Church in Exeter, marked with a simple stone that gives her name and dates. For decades, it was forgotten. Just another old grave in a rural cemetery. But in recent years, it has become a pilgrimage site. People leave offerings, flowers, coins, small trinkets. Some come because they are interested in the folklore. Others come because they see Mercy as a victim, not of vampirism, but of ignorance and fear. Her grave has been vandalized multiple times, the stone damaged by those seeking souvenirs or performing their own rituals. The Mercy Brown case marks the end of the vampire panic in America. After 1892, there are no more documented cases of vampire exhumation in the United States. Medical knowledge advanced. Tuberculosis was identified, understood, and eventually treated. The old beliefs faded, but they did not disappear entirely. They transformed. They moved from the cemetery to the page, from ritual to literature. And in 1897, 5 years after Mercy Brown's exhumation, an Irish author named Bram Stoker would publish a novel that would change the vampire forever. Vienna, Austria, 1732. The Imperial War Council has a problem. Reports are flooding in from the Balkans describing a phenomenon that no one can explain. Corpses that do not decay, bodies that bleed when staked, entire villages gripping by terror of the dead. The council does what bureaucracies do when confronted with the inexplicable. They convene a committee. They summon physicians, theologians, and natural philosophers. And they ask a question that will consume European intellectual discourse for the next 50 years. Are vampires real? The debate that followed was not between believers and skeptics. It was between different kinds of believers. No one denied that bodies were being exhumed and found in states that defied normal decomposition. No one disputed the testimony of imperial officials like Frombald and Fluckinger, educated men who had witnessed the exhumations and documented what they saw. The question was not whether these things were happening. The question was why. And the answers revealed how desperately the Enlightenment mind struggled to reconcile observation with reason. The first explanation was theological. The church argued that vampires were real, but they were not undead corpses. They were demons inhabiting the bodies of the deceased, reanimating them for evil purposes. This explanation had the advantage of fitting within Christian cosmology. Demons were real. Possession was documented. Exorcism was established practice. The vampire, in this view, was simply another form of demonic infestation. The solution was spiritual. Stake the body to trap the demon, burn the remains to destroy its vessel, consecrate the ground to prevent future attacks. But this explanation troubled many theologians. If demons could reanimate corpses at will, why did it only happen in certain regions? Why did vampires attack family members specifically? Why did the pattern follow consumption so precisely? And most troubling, if this was demonic, why did physical destruction work? Demons were spiritual beings. A wooden stake should not be able to kill a demon. The theological explanation raised more questions than it answered. The medical explanation was more complex. Physicians in Vienna, Paris, and London studied the reports from the Balkans and proposed a radical theory. The vampires were not dead. They had been buried alive. This was the premature burial hypothesis, and it was not as absurd as it sounds. In the 18th century, the line between death and unconsciousness was poorly understood. People who fell into comas, who suffered cataleptic seizures, who entered death-like states from fever or shock, were sometimes declared dead and buried. If such a person revived in the coffin, they would claw at the lid, consuming the air, suffocating slowly. The marks on the inside of coffins, the torn fingernails, the contorted positions, these were evidence of premature burial. But the premature burial theory could not explain the vampire phenomenon. Bodies exhumed after weeks or months in the ground were not showing signs of recent death. They were showing signs of preservation. Peter Plogojowitz had been dead for 3 months. Arnold Paole had been staked after 3 weeks. Mercy Brown had been in frozen ground for 2 months. None of these people could have been alive when buried. The preservation was the mystery, not the burial. The answer, though no one fully understood it at the time, lay in the decomposition. Human bodies decay at different rates depending on temperature, soil composition, burial depth, and cause of death. A body buried in frozen ground will remain preserved for months. A body buried in a sealed coffin will decompose differently than one buried in loose soil. A body that died of hemorrhage with blood pooling in the tissues will look different when exhumed than a body that died of starvation. What the villagers interpreted as signs of undead life were actually signs of normal but variable decomposition. Consider the specific signs that identified a vampire. The body appears lifelike, with ruddy skin. This is livor mortis, blood settling in the lower parts of the body after death, creating the appearance of color. The skin sloughs off, revealing fresh skin beneath. This is not new skin growing. It is the outer layer of epidermis separating from the dermis, a normal stage of decomposition. The hair and nails appear to have grown. They have not. The skin around them has contracted, making them appear longer. These are not supernatural changes. They are natural processes that people did not understand. The blood was the most convincing evidence. When a stake was driven through a corpse's chest, blood would flow from the mouth. Fresh blood, red blood, blood that proved the vampire had been feeding. But this was not blood. It was decomposition fluid, a mixture of liquefied tissue, hemoglobin, and bodily fluids that accumulates in the chest cavity as the organs break down. In poor light, in a grave, to observers who expected to see blood, it looked like blood. And when the stake pierced the chest cavity and compressed the lungs, gas escaped, forcing the fluid up through the throat. The corpse appeared to bleed. The corpse appeared to groan. But it was air and liquid, nothing more. Tuberculosis was the final piece. The disease that the villagers called consumption was the engine of the vampire panic. Tuberculosis is caused by bacteria that attack the lungs and spread through the air. It is highly contagious in close quarters. It progresses slowly, over months or years, wasting the victim away. And it clusters in families because families live together, breathe the same air, share the same spaces. To people who did not understand contagion, who did not know about bacteria or airborne transmission, the pattern looked like predation. The father dies of consumption, then the mother, then the children. Something is passing from the dead to the living. Something is feeding. The vampire was a medical diagnosis for an infectious disease. It was wrong, but it was logical. The pattern was observed correctly. Consumption did move through families. The mechanism was misunderstood. The dead were not rising, but the living were inhaling bacteria from the sick. The solution was ineffective, but psychologically necessary. Destroying the first victim's body did nothing to stop the spread of the disease. But it gave the survivors a sense of control, a feeling that they had fought back against the invisible killer. Enlightenment thinkers struggled with this. Voltaire, the French philosopher, wrote extensively about the vampire panic. He mocked it as peasant superstition, as evidence that humanity was still mired in medieval ignorance. But Voltaire also acknowledged the reports, the testimony of imperial officials, the documented cases. He proposed that the bodies were preserved by natural causes: saltpeter in the soil, unusual cold, special conditions that prevented decay. But he could not explain why the villagers believed so uniformly in vampires, why the panic spread so quickly, why rational people participated in exhumations. The answer, though Voltaire did not fully grasp it, was that the vampire was not irrational. It was pre-scientific. The villagers of Serbia and Rhode Island were observing real phenomena: bodies that appeared preserved, diseases that clustered in families, deaths that followed patterns. They were interpreting these observations through the only framework available to them: folklore, tradition, the stories passed down through generations. In a world without germ theory, without medical understanding of decomposition, the vampire was the best explanation they had. By the mid-18th century, the medical community had reached a consensus. The vampire was not real. The bodies were preserved by natural causes. The diseases were contagious, but not supernatural. The exhumations were tragic, but understandable responses to inexplicable death. Governments across Europe issued decrees forbidding vampire exhumations. The church condemned the practice. Physicians published treatises explaining decomposition. Slowly, the vampire panic subsided. The last documented cases occurred in the late 18th century in Eastern Europe and in the late 19th century in America, and then it stopped. But the vampire did not die. It transformed. It moved from the cemetery to the imagination. It became metaphor, symbol, archetype. The disease that clustered in families became the curse passed through bloodlines. The corpse that appeared lifelike became the immortal who never ages. The stake through the heart became the weapon of the heroic vampire hunter. All the medical reality, all the desperate attempts to stop consumption, all the grief and terror of watching your family die, all of this was transmuted into fiction. In the next chapter, we will trace that transformation. We will see how the vampire of folklore became the vampire of literature. We will watch as Bram Stoker took the reports from Medvegia and Exeter and turned them into Count Dracula. We will understand what was lost in that translation and what was gained. Because the vampire we know today, the seductive immortal in the black cape, is not the vampire that haunted Eastern Europe. It is the vampire that we needed, the one that makes death romantic instead of terrifying, the one that makes the plague beautiful instead of brutal. London, England, May 26, 1897. A new novel appears in bookshop windows across the city. The cover shows a simple design, the title in bold letters, the author's name beneath. Dracula, by Bram Stoker. The reviews are mixed, and some call it sensational, others find it derivative. No one predicts that this book will transform the vampire forever, that it will erase 2 centuries of folklore and replace it with something entirely new. No one knows that the real vampire, the corpse bloated with decomposition fluid, the plague that moved through families, the desperate rituals in frozen cemeteries, is about to be forgotten. Bram Stoker was a theater manager, not a folklorist. He never visited Eastern Europe. He never witnessed a vampire exhumation. He never spoke to the families who dug up their dead in terror and desperation. What he had were books. He had read the reports from Medvegia. He had studied the accounts of Arnold Paole and Peter Plogojowitz. He had access to the vampire literature that had circulated through European intellectual circles for a century. And he took this raw material, these government documents, these medical reports, these testimonies of grief and horror, and he transformed them into entertainment. Dracula is not a faithful representation of the vampire folklore. It is a deliberate sanitization, a conscious effort to make the vampire safe for Victorian sensibilities. The real vampire was a peasant, a farmer, someone you knew in life who became monstrous in death. Stoker's vampire is a count, an aristocrat, exotic and foreign. The real vampire was bloated and corrupt, reeking of the grave. Stoker's vampire is elegant and seductive, dressed in evening clothes. The real vampire attacked family members, following the pattern of contagion. Stoker's vampire preys on strangers, spreading his curse like a predator, not a disease. But Stoker did preserve certain details. The stake through the heart came from Medvegia, from the account of Arnold Paole groaning when the wood pierced his chest. The idea that vampires could not enter a home without invitation came from Eastern European folklore, from the belief that the vampire was bound by certain rules, certain limitations, the vulnerability to garlic, to holy symbols, to running water. These were folk remedies documented in the Habsburg reports, transformed by Stoker into narrative devices. He took the tools of the vampire hunter and made them heroic instead of desperate. What Stoker removed was the grief. The real vampire panics were family tragedies. They were fathers watching their children die one after another, mothers begging for any solution, any hope. They were communities torn apart by disease they could not understand, driven to desecrate the graves of people they loved, because the alternative was watching everyone die. There is nothing romantic about George Brown digging up his daughter Mercy and burning her heart. There is nothing seductive about the villagers of Medvegia opening 13 graves and decapitating the corpses. This was horror, real horror, the kind that leaves scars. Stoker understood that Victorian readers did not want real horror. They wanted Gothic romance. They wanted the thrill of danger without the reality of death. So he gave them Count Dracula, powerful but defeatable, seductive but ultimately evil, a threat that could be vanquished by brave men armed with faith, and the vampire became a villain in a novel instead of a diagnosis in a medical report. And in that transformation, something was lost. But something was also gained. Dracula succeeded where the medical treatises failed. It kept the vampire alive in cultural memory. Without Stoker's novel, the vampire might have faded into obscurity, remembered only by folklorists and historians. The cases of Arnold Paole and Mercy Brown might have remained buried in archives, forgotten footnotes to the history of tuberculosis. Instead, the vampire became immortal. It became a symbol, an archetype, a lens through which we examine our deepest fears about death, contagion, and loss of control. The 20th century transformed the vampire even further. Film gave it a visual language. Bela Lugosi in the black cape, Christopher Lee with the fangs, Gary Oldman with the elaborate costumes. Each generation reinvented the vampire to reflect contemporary anxieties. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the vampire was about class and exploitation. In the 1970s, it was about sexuality. And in the 21st century, it became about immortality and eternal youth, about the fear of aging in a culture obsessed with staying forever young. But trace it back far enough, and you always return to the same source. The villages of Serbia and Wallachia, the farmhouses of Rhode Island, the frozen graves and the desperate families. The vampire, in its original form, was about tuberculosis. It was about watching someone you love waste away, coughing blood, growing pale, fading before your eyes. It was about the disease moving through the family like a curse. It was about the moment when rational people did irrational things, because the alternative was to do nothing while everyone died. Today, we have cured tuberculosis. Antibiotics can stop the disease that killed millions across centuries. The vampire, as a medical phenomenon, is extinct. But the vampire, as a cultural phenomenon, is more alive than ever. We have divorced it entirely from its origins. Most people who watch vampire movies or read vampire novels have no idea that the legend came from real exhumations, real graves, real families performing real acts of desecration in real terror. The vampire has become fiction so completely that we have forgotten it was once fact. This forgetting is both a tragedy and a mercy. It is a tragedy because the real stories, the Browns, the Paoles, the Plogojowitz, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to Dracula, but as human beings who suffered and died, and whose families made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Their grief was real. Their fear was justified. Their actions, however brutal, came from love and desperation. To reduce them to source material for Gothic fiction is to erase their humanity. But it is a mercy because the real vampire was too terrible to remember unchanged. The image of George Brown cutting the heart from his daughter's corpse, of Edwin Brown drinking the ashes of Mercy's heart in a desperate attempt to cure his consumption, of entire villages gathered around open graves burning the bodies of their neighbors. These images are too brutal for popular culture. We needed Stoker to give us distance, to transform the plague into account, the desperation into adventure. We needed the vampire to become beautiful because the reality was too ugly to bear. So we closed the grave. We placed the earth back over the coffins of Arnold Paole and Peter Plogojowitz and Mercy Lena Brown. We let them rest, and we acknowledge what they were. Not monsters, not villains, but victims. Victims of a disease that we now understand and can cure. Victims of a time when the only explanations for inexplicable death were supernatural ones. Victims of a panic that, in hindsight, looks like madness, but was, in its moment, the only logic available. The vampire before Dracula was not a creature of the night. It was a corpse in the ground, preserved by cold or chance, misinterpreted by grief and fear. It was a pattern of disease, a cluster of deaths, a family curse that was actually bacteria traveling through the air. It was a solution, stake and fire and ash, that did nothing to stop the spread, but everything to give the survivors a sense of control. It was human beings doing terrible things for understandable reasons, and it was real. If you found value in this exploration of the forgotten vampire, the one that existed before literature made it safe, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And I want to hear from you. Knowing the real history, can you still enjoy vampire fiction? Or does the reality make the romance feel hollow? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because the vampire is not just a monster, it is a mirror. And what it reflects is not the undead, but us. Our fear of death, our desperate need for answers, and our ability to transform even the darkest chapters of history into stories we can bear to tell. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful and your loved ones healthy. This has been the story of the vampire before Dracula, the one history tried to bury but could never quite kill.